I stood in that grocery store parking lot with my keys shaking in my hand, staring at a man who was supposed to be 6 feet underground. He was laughing, he was healthy, he was holding another woman's hand like he had never once belonged to me. My husband, the man I buried with my own 2 hands full of dirt, the man I cried over for 6 straight months, was standing 40 feet away from me, very much alive, and in that moment, I understood that everything I thought I knew about my life, about my marriage, about grief itself, was a lie built for me by someone I trusted more than I trusted myself. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Maya Bennett, and 6 months before that parking lot, I was a widow, 34 years old, living in a quiet brick house on the edge of Atlanta, raising 2 children on my own, and carrying a grief so heavy that some mornings I couldn't remember how to stand up out of bed. My husband, Marcus Bennett, had died in what everyone told me was a car accident on a rain-soaked highway outside the city. There was a funeral. There was a casket. There was a headstone with his name carved into granite. I had touched that stone with my own hands. I had watched it lowered into the earth. Nothing about that day felt like a lie. It felt like the worst truth I had ever lived through. Marcus and I had been married for 9 years. We met at a community college night class, both of us working full days and studying at night, both of us hungry for something better than where we started. He proposed to me in the parking lot of that very same grocery store, on one knee, holding a ring he had saved 4 months of overtime pay to afford. I remember laughing so hard I couldn't say yes right away. And he just knelt there smiling, patient, sure of himself, sure of us. That was the Marcus I married. Steady, devoted, the kind of man who called his mother every Sunday and never missed a single one of our children's birthdays, not once, not ever, in 9 years. Which is exactly why none of what came after made any sense to me. The night he died, he had told me he was driving to Chattanooga for a supply run for the small logistics company he had started 2 years earlier. He kissed me on the forehead, told our daughter Zora to finish her homework before bed, told our son Isaiah to stop staying up late playing video games, and walked out the front door at 8:15 in the evening. I never saw him walk back through it. At 11:40 that night, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and a police officer on the other end of the line told me there had been a single vehicle accident on Highway 27. He told me the vehicle had gone off the road in heavy rain and struck a guardrail before catching fire. He told me the driver did not survive. He told me, gently, that identification had been difficult because of the condition of the vehicle, but that dental records and the registration confirmed it was my husband's truck, and my husband behind the wheel. I don't remember driving to the hospital that night. I don't remember who picked up my children from school the next morning. Grief does that to a person. It erases entire days and leaves only fragments. A hand on my shoulder, the smell of hospital coffee, my mother-in-law Diane collapsing into a waiting room chair when she heard the news. What I do remember, clearly, painfully, is being told by the funeral home that due to the severity of the fire, a closed casket would be necessary. I remember asking to see him anyway, just once, just to say goodbye properly, and I remember being gently, firmly told no, that it would not be something I would want to carry with me. At the time I believed that was kindness. Looking back now, I understand it was something else entirely, something calculated, something designed to make sure I never asked the one question that would have unraveled everything from the very beginning. Why was there no body for me to see? I buried an empty promise that day, though I did not know it yet. 300 people came to the funeral. Co-workers, church members, family from as far as Charlotte and Memphis. Marcus's business partner, a quiet man named Devin Hayes, stood beside me at the graveside and held my hand the entire service, whispering that he would make sure the children and I were taken care of, that Marcus would have wanted that. I thanked him through my tears and thought nothing of how tightly he gripped my hand, how his eyes kept moving toward the casket like he was checking, like he needed to be certain of something the rest of us already believed without question. The 6 months that followed were the hardest of my life. I went back to work as a nurse 3 weeks after the funeral, because the mortgage did not care that I was grieving. I sat through Isaiah's nightmares, where he would wake up screaming for his father, and I held Zora while she cried into her pillow, because she said the house felt too quiet, without him whistling in the kitchen every morning. I learned to sleep on one side of the bed, because the other side had become a place I could no longer look at without my chest caving in. Diane, My mother-in-law called every single day, sometimes just to hear my voice, sometimes to remind me that Marcus was watching over us, that he would want me to keep moving forward. I believed her. I believed everyone. I had no reason not to. It was Devon who handled most of the business affairs after Marcus passed, gently explaining that the logistics company had outstanding debts, that the life insurance payout would take time to process, that I should let him manage the loose ends so I could focus on my children. I signed papers I barely read because grief made everything blur together, because I trusted the people my husband had trusted. Looking back, I have asked myself 1,000 times how I missed it, how I sat across from Devon Hayes at my own kitchen table and never once noticed the way his hands trembled when I asked simple questions, the way he changed the subject whenever I mentioned wanting to visit the crash site, the way he insisted, again and again, that closure meant leaving the past exactly where it was. 6 months is a strange amount of time, long enough for the world to move on around you, short enough that your own grief still feels raw every single morning. I had started, just barely, to feel like I could breathe again. I had started packing away some of Marcus's clothes, not to erase him, but because Diane suggested it might help the children heal if the house didn't feel like a shrine. I had started letting myself laugh again at small things, a joke from a coworker, something silly Isaiah said at dinner. I thought I was healing. I thought the worst was behind me. I had absolutely no idea that the worst was still waiting, patiently, in a grocery store parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, wearing a shirt I had never seen before, holding a hand that was not mine. That Tuesday started like any other. I had picked up Isaiah from school early for a dentist appointment, and afterward we stopped at the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. Something simple, chicken and rice, the kind of meal Marcus used to request on nights he came home exhausted from work. Isaiah was in the passenger seat scrolling through his phone while I pulled into a parking spot near the entrance, and that's when I saw him. Across the lot, near the cart return, a man in a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, laughing at something the woman beside him had said, his hand wrapped around hers like it belonged there. My hands froze on the steering wheel, my breath caught somewhere in my throat and refused to move. Because that laugh, that exact laugh, the one that used to fill our kitchen every Sunday morning, was a sound I would have recognized anywhere on earth, even after 6 months of silence, even after I had convinced myself I would never hear it again. I told myself I was wrong. I told myself grief plays tricks on people, that I had read articles about widows seeing their husbands in strangers on the street, in crowds, in dreams that felt too real to shake off. I told myself to start the car and drive home, and forget what I thought I saw. But my body would not listen to reason. I opened the car door before I even decided to, told Isaiah to stay put, and walked across that parking lot on legs that did not feel like my own, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, praying I was wrong and terrified that I wasn't. I was 8 feet away when he turned his head slightly, laughing at something the woman said, and I saw his profile clearly in the afternoon light, the small scar above his eyebrow from a bicycle accident when he was 12 years old, a story he had told me on our 3rd date, the way his jaw set when he smiled, with his mouth closed instead of open. 9 years of marriage teaches you a person's face in a way that 6 months of grief cannot erase, no matter how hard the world tries to convince you otherwise. It was him. It was Marcus. Alive, healthy, standing in broad daylight, holding another woman's hand like he had built an entire life I knew nothing about, while I was home teaching our children how to survive without him. I did not scream. I did not run toward him the way people do in movies. I stood frozen on that pavement, and for one long, suspended moment, our eyes met across the distance between us. And what I saw in his face was not confusion. It was not shock at seeing a ghost of his own making standing in a parking lot. What I saw, unmistakably, was recognition, followed immediately by fear, the specific fear of a man who has just watched his carefully built lie start to collapse in real time. He knew exactly who I was. He knew exactly what he had done. And in the half-second before he grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her quickly toward a car parked at the far end of the lot, I understood with a certainty that turned my stomach to ice, that my husband's death had never been an accident at all. It had been a decision. His decision. And I intended to find out exactly why. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, replaying the parking lot over and over in my mind, the scar above his eyebrow, the fear in his eyes, the way he grabbed that woman's arm and disappeared before I could take a single step toward him. Isaiah had asked me in the car why I looked so pale, and I told him I felt sick, because I could not bring myself to tell my 11-year-old son that the father he mourned every single night might be alive somewhere in the city, choosing not to come home. I needed proof before I said a word to my children. I needed proof before I said a word to anyone. The first person I thought to call was Diane, Marcus's mother, the woman who had cried harder at that funeral than almost anyone else in the room. But something stopped my hand from dialing her number. If Marcus was alive, someone had helped him disappear. Someone had arranged a funeral for an empty casket. Someone had stood beside me at that graveside and let me believe I was burying my husband. And the person who came to mind first, the person who had controlled every detail of those 6 months, was Devin Hayes. I thought back to the weeks after the funeral, to every conversation I had dismissed as simple grief-stricken confusion. Devin insisting he handle the life insurance paperwork himself instead of letting me deal directly with the company. Devin showing up unannounced at odd hours, always with a reason, always with paperwork that needed a signature. Devin's insistence that visiting the crash site would only cause me more pain, that some things were better left undisturbed. At the time I had thought he was being protective, a loyal business partner, honoring his best friend's memory by shielding his widow from further suffering. Now every one of those moments felt like a brick in a wall, built specifically to keep me from asking questions. The following morning, I called in sick to the hospital for the first time in 3 years. I dropped the kids at school and drove straight to the small logistics office Marcus and Devin had built together, a modest unit in a strip of warehouses on the industrial side of town. I had not set foot in that building since before the funeral. Devin's truck was parked outside, and my hands were shaking as I walked through the front door, the bell above it chiming the same way it always had, as though nothing in the world had changed, as though I had not just watched a dead man walk across a parking lot the day before. Devin looked up from his desk and his face went through 3 distinct expressions in the span of 2 seconds. Surprise, because I had never once come by unannounced since Marcus died. Warmth, the practiced kind he always wore around me. And then, just barely, something that flickered underneath both of those, something that looked almost like dread. I asked him plainly, without any preamble, whether he had seen Marcus recently. I watched his throat move as he swallowed before answering, and I watched him force a small, confused laugh, the kind people use when they are buying themselves time to think. He asked me if I was feeling okay, told me grief could play cruel tricks on the mind, reminded me gently that Marcus had passed away 6 months ago, as if I needed reminding of the worst day of my life. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him outright. I had spent 9 years married to a man who worked closely enough with Devin Hayes to trust him with the future of our family, and some instinct told me that pushing too hard, too fast, would only make him more careful, more guarded. Instead, I told him I must have been mistaken, that I had seen a man who resembled Marcus at the grocery store, and it had shaken me badly. I watched the relief spread across his face before he could hide it, and that relief told me everything his words had tried to conceal. A man who truly believed his friend was dead does not feel relief when told a widow was simply confused. He feels concern. He feels sympathy. What I saw on Devin's face was the unmistakable relaxation of a man who had just been told his secret was still safe. I left that office and sat in my car in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive. My hands would not stop shaking, not from fear this time, but from a rising, cold anger that I had not allowed myself to feel in 6 months of grieving. If Devin knew something, if Devin had helped orchestrate whatever I had witnessed, then the man who held my hand at my husband's graveside, who promised to take care of my children, had been lying to my face every single day since the moment Marcus supposedly died. I decided, sitting there in that parking lot, that I would not confront anyone again until I had something undeniable. Something that could not be explained away with a sympathetic smile and a gentle reminder of my grief. That night, after the children were asleep, I opened the small fireproof lockbox where Marcus and I kept our important documents, insurance policies, the deed to the house, copies of his business paperwork. I had not touched it since the lawyer walked me through the life insurance claim months earlier. This time I read every page slowly, carefully, looking for anything that had slipped past me the first time, when grief had clouded every word on every form. And there, tucked between 2 insurance documents, I found something I had never noticed before, A folded receipt from a storage facility across town, dated only 3 weeks before Marcus's supposed accident, with a monthly payment plan set up under a name I did not recognize. Marcus James Whitfield. His middle name paired with a last name that belonged to no one in our family. I sat on the floor of our bedroom closet with that receipt in my hands for a long time, staring at a name my husband had apparently been using, for reasons I could not begin to understand. 9 years of marriage, 2 children, a life built together brick by brick, and somewhere along the way, he had built another name, another identity, quietly, without a single word to me. I thought about every late night he claimed was a supply run, every business trip that stretched an extra day longer than expected, every phone call he took in the garage with the door closed, because, he told me, work stress gave him a headache and he needed quiet. I had believed every excuse, because I had no reason not to. Trust is a strange thing. It does not ask for evidence. It simply exists, quietly, until the day something forces you to look for proof you never thought you would need. The next morning, I drove to that storage facility before my shift, using the address printed on the receipt. The manager at the front desk, an older man with tired eyes and a name tag reading Harold, did not recognize me, but he recognized the unit number immediately when I asked. Almost too quickly for someone managing hundreds of units across a large facility. He told me the account was current, paid automatically each month, and that the last access to the unit had been recorded only 11 days earlier. 11 days, 5 months after I buried my husband, someone had walked into that storage unit and unlocked it with a key. My chest tightened as I asked Harold if he could tell me who had accessed it, and he told me, apologetically, that he was not authorized to share that information without proper documentation, that I would need to prove ownership or involve law enforcement. I left the facility with my mind racing, turning over every possibility, each one darker than the last. Had Marcus faked his own death to escape a life he no longer wanted, choosing a stranger's name and a new identity over his own family? Had something more dangerous forced his hand? A debt, a threat, an enemy I knew nothing about? Or had Devon been involved from the very beginning, helping his business partner disappear for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with money? The logistics company had been struggling before Marcus died. I remembered that much from the hushed conversations Devon had with me about outstanding debts. I wondered, sitting in my car outside that storage facility, whether my husband's death, his supposed death, had been less about escaping me and more about escaping something, or someone, far more dangerous than a marriage he had grown tired of. I picked the children up from school that afternoon and tried, as best I could, to act as though nothing in my world had shifted, though every part of me felt like I was standing on ground that could open beneath my feet at any moment. Zora asked me at dinner why I kept looking at my phone, and I told her I was waiting on an important message from work, a lie that came easier than I wanted to admit. Isaiah, quieter than usual, asked if I still missed his father, and something in his voice made my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the grief I had carried for 6 months. Grief that I now understood might have been built on a foundation of lies I could not yet fully see. That night, after the children were finally asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, searching for anything I could find about Marcus James Whitfield, the name from that storage receipt. It took nearly 2 hours of digging through public records, but eventually, I found a small apartment lease agreement, filed under that name, dated 4 months earlier, in a building 30 minutes across town, in a neighborhood I had never once had reason to visit. My hands trembled as I stared at the address on the screen. Somewhere across the city, my husband, the man I had buried, the man my children still cried for in the middle of the night, had built himself an entirely new life, complete with a new name, a new home, and apparently, a new woman to hold his hand in broad daylight, without a single trace of guilt on his face. I closed the laptop, sat in the darkness of my kitchen, and made a decision. I was going to that address, and I was going to get the truth, no matter what it cost me to find it. I did not go to that apartment right away. As angry as I was, as much as every part of me wanted to drive across town and pound on that door until someone answered, a quieter voice inside me insisted on caution. Marcus, or whoever he had become, had already shown me in that parking lot that he was capable of disappearing in an instant. If I showed up alone and unannounced, I risked losing him again, risked watching him vanish a second time, before I ever got a single honest answer. So instead, I spent 2 days watching from a distance, parking my car down the block during the hours my children were in school, learning the rhythm of a life my husband had built without me. The apartment building was a mid-rise complex with a small courtyard and a security gate that opened with a key fob. Modern, clean, nothing like the modest brick house we had raised our children in together. On the second day, just after 10 in the morning, I watched the same woman from the grocery store parking lot walk out of the building alone, dressed for work in a blazer and slacks, climbing into a silver sedan and driving away. My pulse quickened. If she was gone for the day, this was my chance. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes, gathering the courage to move, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, before I finally stepped out and walked toward the building's front entrance. I did not have a key fob, but an older resident was leaving just as I approached, and I slipped through the door behind her with a polite smile, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain she could hear it. I found the unit number I had memorized from the lease agreement, 3rd floor, apartment 314, and stood outside that door for a long moment, staring at the peephole, wondering what version of my husband was waiting on the other side. I knocked 3 times, firm, controlled, and listened to footsteps approach from inside. When the door opened, I watched the color drain completely from Marcus's face. He stood there in gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt, barefoot, a coffee mug still in his hand, staring at me like he was looking at his own ghost instead of the other way around. For a moment, neither of us said a single word. I studied his face, searching for some explanation to reveal itself before he even spoke, some sign that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that there was an innocent reason my husband was standing very much alive in an apartment I had never known existed. But there was no innocent explanation written anywhere on his face. There was only guilt, raw and undisguised, and beneath it, something that looked almost like fear of me, fear of what I might do now that I had found him. I asked him, my voice steadier than I expected, how long he had been alive. He set the coffee mug down slowly on a side table, his hands trembling slightly, and asked me to come inside so we could talk without the whole hallway hearing us. I hesitated only a moment before stepping through that door, some part of me desperate for the truth, no matter how much it might destroy me to hear it. The apartment was sparsely furnished. Clearly someone had not fully settled into this life yet, boxes still stacked in a corner of the living room, a single-family photograph of our children sitting face down on a bookshelf, as though he could not bear to look at them, but also could not bring himself to throw the picture away. Marcus began talking before I could ask another question, the words tumbling out fast, almost rehearsed, like he had imagined this conversation happening someday, and had already built his defense. He told me the logistics company had been in far worse financial trouble than he had ever let me know, that months before his supposed death, he had borrowed money from people he should never have trusted, dangerous people, people who did not accept missed payments as an excuse. He told me threats had started coming, first against him, then against the business, and eventually, chillingly, against our children. He said he had panicked, that Devon had come up with the idea of the accident as a way to make the debt disappear along with him, collecting on a life insurance policy large enough to pay off what he owed and disappear before anyone came looking for the money instead. I sat down slowly on the arm of a couch I did not recognize, trying to absorb what he was telling me, the sheer scale of the deception unfolding faster than my mind could process it. He told me Devon had found the body used in the accident, a man who had died of natural causes with no family to claim him, arranged through a contact at a funeral supply company who owed Devon a favor from years earlier. He told me the fire had been set deliberately to make identification through anything other than dental records nearly impossible, and that Devon had bribed someone at the coroner's office to confirm the identification without asking too many questions. Every detail he shared made my stomach turn further, not just because of the lies, but because of how carefully planned each piece had been, how long they must have worked on this before that rainy night on Highway 27. I asked him, my voice breaking despite my best effort to stay composed, why he had not simply come to me, why he had not told me the truth, and let us face the danger together as a family, the way we had faced every other hardship in 9 years of marriage. His answer, when it came, was quiet and almost pitiful in its simplicity. He said he was afraid that if I knew the truth, I would never have agreed to it, that I would have insisted on going to the police, and that going to the police, in his mind, would have gotten all of us killed by the people he owed money to. He said the plan was never meant to last this long, that he intended to resurface eventually, once enough time had passed, and enough distance had been created between his old life and the debts that had nearly destroyed it. He said he loved me and the children more than anything, and that everything he had done, however wrong it looked from the outside, had been an attempt to protect us. I wanted to believe that love could explain the unexplainable, that somewhere beneath 9 years of marriage there was still a version of the truth I could hold on to. But then I thought of Renee, the woman from the parking lot, the woman who had just walked out of this very apartment that morning dressed for a normal workday, living beside a man she likely believed was single, unaware she had been pulled into the wreckage of a lie far larger than she could imagine. I asked Marcus carefully who she was, and watched him hesitate for the first time since I had walked through that door. He told me Renee did not know the truth, that she believed his name was James Whitfield, a man who had moved to Atlanta after a difficult divorce, and that she had no idea she was involved with a man who had faked his own death and abandoned 2 children who still cried for him every single night. Something inside me went cold and still in that moment, a kind of clarity replacing the shock and grief that had carried me through the last 6 months. This was not a man who had been forced into an impossible situation and made the least terrible choice available to him. This was a man who had built an entirely new life, complete with a new identity and a new relationship, while his real family grieved him in a house 30 minutes away. Whatever danger had started this, Marcus had clearly settled comfortably into the lie, long after the danger, if it had ever truly existed at all, had passed. I stood up from that couch and told him, plainly, that I needed proof, real proof, of the debt, of the threats, of everything he claimed had forced his hand, because I no longer trusted a single word that came out of his mouth without something solid behind it. And as I said those words, I saw something shift behind his eyes, something calculating, something that told me my husband was already 3 steps ahead of me, already deciding what version of the truth he was willing to let me see. I left that apartment with my mind racing faster than I could organize into coherent thought. Marcus had asked me, almost pleaded with me, to give him time to gather what he called proof, documents showing the debt, messages showing the threats, something that would make his story hold together under the weight of my disbelief. I told him I would give him 3 days, not because I trusted him, but because I needed those 3 days myself, to think, to plan, and to decide what kind of truth I was actually prepared to live with once I finally had it in front of me. Driving home that afternoon, I found myself replaying every detail of our conversation, searching for the seams in a story that had sounded, in the moment, almost convincing. But the longer I sat with it, the more the timeline troubled me. If Marcus had truly been running from dangerous people who threatened our children, why had he spent 5 months living quietly in an apartment across town, instead of fleeing the city entirely, or at the very least reaching out to warn me so I could protect Zora and Isaiah myself? A man protecting his family does not simply vanish and let his wife raise their children alone, under a fabricated threat neither of them understood. Something about his explanation felt shaped, edited, a story built to justify what he wanted me to believe, rather than what had actually happened. That evening, once the children were asleep, I called my cousin Angela, a paralegal who had helped me understand legal paperwork more than once over the years. I did not tell her everything, not yet, only that I needed to understand how a life insurance payout could be investigated for fraud, and what kind of evidence would hold up if someone suspected a death had been staged. Angela, without asking too many questions, walked me through the basics, explaining that insurance fraud investigations often started with financial trails, unusual withdrawals, sudden account closures, life insurance policies taken out or increased shortly before a death. She mentioned, almost in passing, that fraudulent death claims frequently unraveled because the person responsible for arranging them underestimated how thoroughly a determined family member could dig once suspicion took root. Her words stayed with me long after we hung up the phone. I thought of Devon again, of how quickly the life insurance payout had processed compared to what Angela described as typical timelines, of how insistent he had been about handling every piece of paperwork himself instead of letting me deal directly with the insurance company. If Marcus's story about dangerous debts was true, Devon had been the one to suggest the plan, which meant Devon knew everything from the very beginning, meant Devon had sat across from me at my own kitchen table, watched me sign papers through tears, and said absolutely nothing while I mourned a man he knew to be alive and well 30 minutes across town. The next morning, I did something I had not done in 6 months. I drove to the county courthouse and requested access to public probate and insurance filing records related to Marcus's estate. It took nearly 2 hours of waiting and paperwork, but eventually a clerk handed me copies of documents I had signed without fully reading in the fog of my grief. Buried in the fine print was something that made my hands go cold. 3 months before his supposed death, Marcus had increased his life insurance policy from a modest amount meant to cover funeral expenses and a portion of the mortgage, to a policy nearly 4 times larger, naming not only myself but also Devin Hayes as a partial beneficiary through a business continuation clause tied to the logistics company. I had never once questioned that clause when I signed it, assuming it was standard practice for small business partnerships. Now it read like a motive laid out in plain black ink. I sat in my car outside the courthouse for a long time, staring at those pages, doing the math in my head. If the payout had been split according to that clause, Devin had walked away with a substantial sum of money the moment Marcus was declared dead, a sum that likely covered whatever business debts Marcus claimed had put our family in danger in the first place. It was entirely possible there had been real debt, real desperation, exactly as Marcus described. But it was also entirely possible that Devin Hayes had seen an opportunity in his partner's panic and shaped the entire plan not to save Marcus from danger, but to profit from his disappearance, while allowing me to believe I had lost my husband to something as random and blameless as a rainy highway and a guardrail. I decided it was time to speak with Renee. Not out of cruelty, not to hurt a woman who, as far as I could tell, was as much a victim of this deception as my children were, but because I needed to know what Marcus, or James Whitfield, had told her, and whether her version of events matched the story he had given me. I found her workplace easily enough, a marketing firm downtown listed on a business card I had noticed on the apartment counter during my visit. I waited outside the building until her shift ended, and when she walked out that evening, I approached her carefully, introducing myself honestly, watching her face shift from polite confusion to visible alarm, as I explained, as gently as I could manage, exactly who I was, and exactly who the man she knew as James Whitfield actually was. Renee did not believe me at first, which I understood completely, because I would not have believed a stranger telling me something so unthinkable either. But when I showed her a photograph on my phone, an old picture from our wedding, Marcus in a suit with his arm around me, unmistakably the same man, I watched the color drain from her face, the same way it had drained from his when I appeared at that apartment door. She told me, her voice shaking, that James had told her he was divorced, that his ex-wife had taken everything in the split, including most of his savings, that he had moved to this side of the city for a fresh start, after years of what he described as a painful, controlling marriage. Hearing him describe our 9 years together, our marriage, our children, in those cruel, dismissive terms, hurt in a way I had not expected, a fresh wound layered directly on top of every other lie he had already told me. Renee asked me, tears now streaming freely down her face, whether I was certain, whether there was any chance this was some kind of terrible misunderstanding. I told her about the funeral, about the closed casket, about 6 months of grief and 2 children who still cried for their father in the middle of the night, and I watched her realize, in real time, that she had not been living beside a man escaping a painful divorce, but a man who had faked his own death and abandoned an entire family to build a new life with her instead. She told me she needed time to process everything, that she had no idea, that she felt sick knowing she had unknowingly been part of destroying a family she did not even know existed. I believed her. Whatever Marcus was, whatever Devin had helped him become, Renee had walked into this situation as blindly as I had walked into that grocery store parking lot, never once suspecting the ground beneath her was built on a lie. That night, Renee called me, her voice steadier but still shaken, and told me something that changed the entire direction of everything I thought I understood. She said that 2 weeks earlier, she had overheard part of a phone conversation Marcus had with someone he called D, a conversation where his tone had shifted from casual to sharp and anxious, where she had heard him say the words, "She can't find out I'm still getting paid. Not yet. Not until the second policy clears." At the time she had assumed it was something related to his job, unremarkable enough that she had not thought twice about it. Now, hearing it again in her memory with new understanding, the words landed differently. A second policy. Money still being paid. Someone he did not want me finding out about. Someone referred to only as D. I sat with my phone pressed to my ear long after the call ended, staring at the dark ceiling of my bedroom, understanding with sickening clarity that whatever Marcus had told me in that apartment was only a fraction of the truth, and that Devin Hayes was far more deeply, far more dangerously involved in all of this than either of us had admitted out loud. I did not sleep after Renee's phone call. I sat with those words turning over and over in my mind. A second policy, money still being paid, someone he did not want me finding out about. By morning, I had made a decision I knew there was no walking back from once it was set in motion. I was done gathering quiet proof on my own. I called Angela again, and this time I told her everything. The parking lot, the storage unit, the apartment, Marcus's confession, the insurance clause naming Devon as a partial beneficiary, and the fragment of a phone call Renee had overheard weeks earlier. Angela listened without interrupting, and when I finished, her voice was steady and serious, in a way I had never heard from her before. She told me this was no longer something I could handle alone at kitchen tables and courthouse counters. This was insurance fraud, likely conspiracy, and possibly worse, and it needed to go to the police, with everything I had documented laid out clearly before Devon or Marcus had any more time to cover their tracks. Before we go further, if you've been with this story from the beginning, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how this one ends. I spent that entire day organizing everything I had gathered: the storage unit receipt, the apartment lease under the name Marcus James Whitfield, the probate documents showing the inflated policy, and Devon's beneficiary clause, and a written account of my conversation with Renee, including the fragment of the phone call she remembered. Angela connected me with a detective she had worked with years earlier on a separate fraud case, a woman named Detective Patricia Owens, known for handling exactly this kind of complicated financial deception. I met with Detective Owens the following morning, laying every document across her desk, watching her expression shift from polite skepticism to focused, serious attention as she worked through the paper trail I had assembled. She told me, plainly, that what I had brought her was more than enough to open a formal investigation, and that cases like this, however painful for the families involved, usually unraveled quickly once the financial trail was properly followed. Detective Owens moved fast. Within 2 days, investigators had subpoenaed banking records connected to both Marcus and Devon, uncovering exactly what Renee's overheard phone call had hinted at. A second, smaller life insurance policy, taken out just 4 months before the staged accident, paid out not to me, but directly into an account controlled jointly by Devon Hayes and a shell entity he had quietly established under a different business name. The larger policy, the one I had signed and believed was standard business protection, had been split according to the beneficiary clause, exactly as I feared, with a significant portion funneled to Devon within weeks of the funeral. Money that records showed had gone toward paying off the very debts Marcus claimed had endangered our family in the first place. Whether the danger had ever been entirely real or partially exaggerated to justify the plan no longer mattered as much as the fact that Devon had profited enormously from a lie built on my grief and my children's suffering. The morning police arrived to arrest Devon Hayes. I was not there to see it, but Detective Owens called me afterward to let me know it was done. She told me Devon had tried, weakly, to claim he had only helped Marcus disappear out of loyalty and fear for his friend's safety, but the financial trail told a far less noble story, one of a business partner who saw an opportunity in his friend's panic and shaped an elaborate fraud scheme designed to benefit himself as much as, if not more than, the man he claimed to be protecting. Marcus was arrested the same afternoon, found still at the apartment I had visited days earlier, having made no attempt to run despite knowing, after my visit, that his secret was already unraveling. Detective Owens told me later that in his initial statement, he admitted the threats against our family had been real at first, but exaggerated by Devon to convince him the fake death was the only viable option, and that once the danger had actually passed, months into his disappearance, greed and fear of consequences had kept him from ever coming forward. I sat my children down that evening, the hardest conversation of my entire life, harder even than the day I told them their father had died. I told them the truth as gently and as honestly as I could manage, that their father was alive, that he had made a terrible, selfish choice, and that he was now facing serious consequences for the pain he had caused all of us. Isaiah cried in a way I had not seen since the funeral itself, a confusing mixture of relief that his father was alive and devastation at understanding what that aliveness had actually cost. Zora, older and quieter in her grief, asked me only one question that night: whether he had ever really loved us at all, or whether the version of him we knew had been a performance the whole time. I did not have a clean answer for her, only the honest truth that some people are capable of loving deeply and still making choices that betray that love beyond repair, and that both things could exist inside the same person, without one excusing the other. In the months that followed, Marcus took a plea deal that spared him the maximum sentence in exchange for full cooperation against Devon, whose case, given the clear financial trail and his central role in orchestrating the staged death, resulted in a considerably harsher sentence for conspiracy and insurance fraud. The life insurance company, once the fraud was confirmed, moved to reclaim the payouts through the courts, a long, exhausting legal process that Angela helped guide me through over the following year. I filed for divorce the same week Marcus was formally charged, unwilling to spend one more day legally bound to a man who had let me bury an empty casket and grieve a death that existed only to serve his own convenience. Renee, to her credit, testified honestly about everything she knew, cooperating fully once she understood the scale of what she had unknowingly been part of. We did not become close. Our situations were too painful, too tangled together for easy friendship. But I never once blamed her for what happened. She had been deceived as thoroughly as I had, simply from a different angle, and watching her rebuild her own sense of trust in the aftermath reminded me that Marcus's lies had rippled outward, far beyond just my household, touching every life he brushed against during those 6 hidden months. It has been nearly a year now since that afternoon in the grocery store parking lot, since I stood frozen watching a dead man laugh under the afternoon sun. My children are healing, slowly, in the uneven way children heal from wounds too complicated for them to fully understand yet. Isaiah still has hard nights, though they come less often now. Zora has grown fiercely protective of the small family we have left, fiercely honest in a way that sometimes catches me off guard with how much wisdom grief has forced into a girl not yet a teenager. I went back to nursing full-time, found strength I did not know I had left in me, and slowly, carefully, began rebuilding a version of trust in myself I thought Marcus had taken from me for good. I think sometimes about that closed casket, about how badly I wanted to see his face one final time, and how gently, firmly, I was told no. I understand now that request was denied, not out of kindness, but out of necessity, a small, quiet piece of a much larger lie that could not survive a widow's eyes looking too closely at a stranger's remains. I buried a lie that day, dressed in my husband's name, mourned by 300 people who believed, as completely as I did, that we were saying goodbye to a good man taken too soon. The truth, when it finally came, was harder in some ways than the grief itself, because grief, however devastating, is honest. It does not ask you to question everything you thought you knew about the person you loved most. Betrayal does, and learning to live inside that truth, to raise my children within it, to rebuild a life on ground I once thought was solid and now understand was hollow the entire time, has been the hardest, most necessary work of my life. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with Maya's story from beginning to end. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming true storytelling videos.